Hello and welcome to day 11 of our USA fall road trip. While overall this trip was turning out to be pretty epic, we always knew there would be one day that would stand out as particularly challenging, where the moving parts never really looked like they fit together too well, and the overall plan for the day just seems a bit too much. This was to be that day. The trip so far had already taken it out of us, and today was really going to push the limits of our already tired and fatigued body and minds. To start off, we were going to cram in as much Niagara-based fun as we could into a shorter time frame as possible. Then we had a date with US Customs and Immigration, followed by an itsy-bitsy 5-hour drive over 280 miles to Cedar Point in Ohio. There we had an epic night of Halloween scares awaiting us. We would start out at 8 AM and still be going at nearly midnight, 300 miles away in a different country and 3 different states away. This is what we live for. As the daylight began to build, the scene out of our window could not have been more different than yesterday. It was still pretty spectacular, but the stunning blue skies and fall colours were replaced by a pretty dull and grey palette. To cheer us up, we decided to head for pancakes. Honestly, we like IHOP, but it's a bit basic. However, this location is situated at the top of the hotel, with views like this. We had a really big day, so it was important to get a big breakfast, so we started off with a couple of pancake combos and a good few pours of coffee to get us going. When we headed out, the weather was still pretty grey and overcast, and the wet weather had brought in a bit of a winter chill. But at least it had stopped raining, and the skies were beginning to clear slightly. The first attraction we wanted to hit was the famous Maid of the Mist cruise. However, there is one big problem with this. The Maid of the Mist sails from the other side of the river, and while we could have hiked across, it seemed pretty pointless when Hornblower ran a nearly identical cruise from the Canadian side. We booked our tickets online for $33 Canadian directly from the Hornblower website and headed over to the first boat of the day. We were a little late to board and didn't get a very good spot on the vessel, with the crowds gathering around the bow. However, we have a top tip here. Don't worry about it. You will be able to stand wherever you want once the cruise gets going. And the cruise got away shortly after boarding. This is a very short cruise, simply taking you up the river to the base of the falls. You were only on the water for 10-15 minutes, but these are all highlight minutes. The views are stunning, and getting this close to the falls is seriously invigorating. The power of the water is stunning and can be felt in your chest as it pounds over the falls. The boat heads right up to the base of the falls, where the mist drenches the boat and its occupants. Almost the whole ride there is a steady drizzle, but as you reach the base of the falls into the horseshoe, and it is at this point around half the tourists packed onto the bow of the boat, run. They did not count on a sudden blast of ice-cold spray being blasted straight in their faces, and despite their complimentary ponchos, the conditions were just too much. This leaves plenty of room up front if you are willing to brave the worst of the conditions. After experiencing the power and majesty of the falls up close, the vessel does a U-turn and lets the current take it back down to the dock. It's a really short trip, but absolutely essential. But yeah, you do get pretty wet despite the poncho. As we headed back up the cliff face to the promenade, we noticed something quite amazing. The grey, cloudy weather seemed to be largely dissipating, leaving nothing but blue skies and sunshine. It was still quite cool, but absolutely beautiful, and we got some amazing shots from the promenade. The next attraction we planned was the journey behind the falls. This was at the far end of the promenade, so we made our way back slowly, now taking in the glorious weather and stunning views. Due to the wind direction, the spray was largely heading over to the other side of the falls and no longer creating a perpetual downpour on the promenade. We'd also pre-booked tickets to the journey and walked straight into the elevators down to the tunnels. If you don't know, the journey behind the falls takes you down to some subterranean tunnels that give you access to the base of the falls. There is a large viewing deck giving great views of the falls and the valley bottom, and there are 2 viewing portals offering an incredible view of the backside of water. Disney jokes apart, these portals were a bit rubbish. You really could not see much, and the brightness outside meant the contrast was so bright you could not really see anything, with the overall effect not really in keeping with the real power of the falls. However, the outdoor deck was worth it alone, and we were pretty happy we paid to come down here, as once again you got really up close and personal with the majesty of the falls. For an attraction where you are likely to get pretty wet, so a free poncho was also included with this attraction. We did start to wonder about the environmental credentials of handing out thousands of ponchos a day, but hey-ho. Finally, it's around lunchtime, we had done all we planned and we had a long drive ahead of us, so we decided to hit the road, trusting in Google Maps to navigate us safely. And for whatever reason, Google calculated the Rainbow Bridge would not be the quickest and instead kept us in Canada a little longer. We left Niagara via the west and onto the Queen Elizabeth Highway for 20 or so miles of pleasant driving before hitting the Peace Bridge, just outside of Buffalo, where we would navigate the border crossing. We already had our ESTA in place and had filled out the electronic I-94 form and had paid the requisite fee of $12. These are all necessary to navigate a land border of the US. The border crossing was pretty slow, however we had anticipated it taking a while. The annoying thing was the queues were not that long, it's just there was a lengthy delay for each car. This naturally did not bode too well for us. However, once at the booth, which took us around 45 minutes, the agent asked us very little. He checked the passports, which obviously showed valid ESTA and I-94 on his system, and he just checked where we had been and what we were doing before waving us through. He actually looked a little confused at the extent of our trip and wanted us gone before we explained any more of our confusing elements of the trip. Overall, it was a process we were dreading and we went through like a breeze. Getting into Canada could not have been easier, and we had no real issues at all getting back into the States. So we highly recommend heading to the Canadian side to see the best of Niagara Falls. Once back in America, we attempted to get a toll-free day. To do this, instead of following the I-90, which would have been the quickest route, we stayed on the slower Route 20/Route 5, which follows the coast more closely. These are smaller highways which pass through small towns and villages and take a lot longer to navigate, but there are no tolls on this road all the way to the Pennsylvanian border. This worked really well, as not only was it more picturesque, we also passed through the Seneca Nation tribe lands, and were able to make use of their tax exemption to get the cheapest gas on the entire trip. We also got to see quite a lot in the way of wild deer and other wildlife, which up until now had been a bit disappointing on this trip. The route was very picturesque and we got to see lots of fall foliage and some nice little towns and villages as we passed along the coastline. However, progress was really slow, and in the end we got stuck behind a long line of cars, all behind someone who had no intention of going over around 40 miles an hour. It was a bit of an issue with still 150 miles to go. However, at the Pennsylvanian border, the I-90 reverts back to toll-free, so at this point we headed back to the interstate and began making much better progress. It was less scenic, but we were moving much faster as we passed through Cleveland and then on to the smaller city of Sandusky. Our next stop was about halfway to the final destination of Chicago, but we were not stopping randomly. Sandusky is the home of Cedar Point, possibly the best theme park in the country, at least in terms of thrill rides. It was currently hosting the last of its Halloweekends, and we were here to have some terrifying spooky fun. We had booked to stay in the Cedar Point Express Hotel, one of Cedar Point's own properties, which comes with a few perks over staying in a local motel. It was not overly expensive, only around $150 a night, and came with free parking both in the park and at the hotel, and early entry into the park. We did not need early entry today as the park opened hours ago, but we were hitting the park tomorrow, so that would come in handy then. The Cedar Point Express Hotel is not on the actual point, but is a mere 5 minutes drive away and offers free parking at both the park and the hotel, so it's still really convenient. The Breakers Hotel and the cabins all look amazing and within walking distance of the park, but are probably better suited to the summer months as it was pretty bleak out on Lake Eerie this late in October. Our room at the Cedar Point Express was pretty much as we expected. This is your typical roadside chain motel type place. Comfy beds, neutral tones, workmanlike fixtures and furnishing, and just about everything you need but very little else. There were splashes of Cedar Point throughout with imagery of the park and the rides, and we have to be honest, it was a lot larger than we expected, but overall it was pretty standard, just enough and a nice spot to spend the next few days. After settling in a while, we headed out to the park, and we had spotted a McDonald's right across the road, so we caved in and just went for the cheapest, easiest food option, with dinner at Mackie D's. The hotel is located on the main route to the park, and to be honest it all felt really quiet, with thick grey skies, howling winds and a near deserted feel. The whole area had a post-apocalyptic feel to it. However, as we drove the short drive over the causeway, we definitely found the people. Even before getting near the entrance to the parking lot, the traffic queues formed and they were long and slow moving. 45 minutes later we were in visual range of the gates and it was a sea of cars. In the end, the agents simply opened the parking lots up and allowed people to flood in with no charge. So much for our free parking. We got directed to the overspill car park and got a spot right at the back, quite where all the cars behind us were planning on going. We had no idea. This meant a long hike in a cold, windy night to the park entrance. We were hoping to get in a little early to get the lay of the land and maybe a couple of rides, but there was no chance. As you would expect, the park was absolutely rammed. This was the last full night of their Halloweekend this year, and it seemed the whole of the Midwest had showed up. We do not do well with queues, and every attraction seemed to have a 1 hour plus queue attached. We started our night at the very back of the park under the shadow of Steel Vengeance with the Bloodbath Haunted Maze. We then headed through Cutthroat Cove, which is a scare zone, to the Freak Show, another haunted maze. These three gave us a good introduction of what to expect from the event, and overall it wasn't that great. The haunted mazes, of which there are 5, were well themed, but they were quite short and there was a real lack of monsters inside. We got very few scares and there was no opportunity to let the maze reset. A near constant flow of people meant the monsters never really came out of nowhere, which is where the real scares are to be found. The scare zones were also a bit of a letdown. These were again well themed, and while there were a ton of monsters and they did a great job of freaking you out, they were always in very specific and defined areas, and there were so many people around it was just a walking procession with some creepy guys in costumes. So our initial impressions were not great. Things didn't improve when just over an hour and a half in, we headed to our 4th attraction, Cornstalkers, a scare zone, and found the queue closed due to capacity. It never reopened and we didn't get to visit what was reviewed as the best attraction at the weekend. There were 5 scare zones in total, but Tombstone Territory and Clown's Death Metal Tour were not proper scare zones, and the Blood of the Bayou was pretty terrible. It was essentially a huge queue that never really went anywhere. We spent nearly an hour getting in and out, found about 5 monsters in some creepy themed areas, and then had to queue to leave. The queue for the Haunted Maze Midnight was showing at well over an hour, and we just couldn't face it. We took the time to visit the Slaughterhouse, which was fantastically themed, but still lacking monsters and jump scares, and the last maze we tried was the Haunting Eerie Estate, which again was lacking in the jump scare department.
I was just yelling at somebody because they didn't like my collection.
Oh, I like it, yeah. It's not real. Yeah. Ah!
Overall, we found the layout, execution and overall imagining of the event to be hugely lacking. Last Halloween we visited the West Coast and the likes of Not Scary Farm blew the Cedar Point Halloween weekend out of the water. It didn't help that this was the last night and it was crazy busy, but we don't think it would have been much better on a quieter evening. It just lacked the impact and spectacle of the West Coast events. You might have noticed we didn't actually do any rides. This is not because we didn't want to, but the focus was on the Halloweekend event. Tomorrow would be all about rides, so we headed back to the car, which was parked almost a mile away from the gate, and then headed back to the comfort of the hotel. The weather was pretty wild, and even more cold and bad weather was forecast for tomorrow, and it was even possible that we would have a washout. Our fingers were crossed for a weather window as we had come a long way for Cedar Point, but the outlook was looking pretty grim. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can see what happens when we visit Cedar Point during the daytime. Bye for now.